Seattle in the mid-1960s was just coming out of a successful World's Fair.
It's the adventure of a lifetime.
But it would be soon famous for something else. A murder that will remain a cold case for decades. There's very little evidence, witnesses, or even suspects for the police to figure out who the murderer is.
Due diligence is the key when you're not presented with witnesses or evidence. You must focus on the basics like evidence collection because it will likely help you in solving the case down the line.
It's a whole new world of evidence collection from today to 50 years ago. However, the basics stay the same. Investigators have a whole new set of tools at their fingertips.
It will take decades for advances in DNA research to reach a point that starts helping solve crimes, but the wait will be worth it.
The unsolved ones, we have to stand up
and approach these cases in a way outside the box.
Let the world know, is those out there that did commit a murder, there are people that are coming after you.
There's just a lot of good people trying to do the right thing.
Because it's something that you have to be passionate about.
Solve this. Bring some peace to the family at least. Just doing my job.
In Seattle, Washington, 1967, Joe Burleson starts his rounds to open up the Seattle Center Parkade. It's been closed for days, which is normal when no events are scheduled. Joe sees a limp body lying in the corner of the elevator and calls out to them. He steps closer, and he sees it's a woman that isn't breathing and has obviously been dead for a while.
In the first 72 hours after death, the body's internal organs will start to decompose. At the 3 to 5 day mark, a deceased body will start to bloat and exhibit signs of purge. These signs are unmistakable.
Time is always of the essence from the moment a body is discovered. It doesn't matter if it's been 5 minutes, 5 days, or 50 years. Investigators are always aware that the crime scene and the body are degrading, which could cause loss of critical evidence, so quick, thorough action is required.
Everybody's planning to see Seattle's spectacular $100 million World's Fair.
The 1962 World's Fair in Seattle, Washington, also known as the Century 21 Exposition, attracted more than 9 million visitors between April 21st and October 21st, 1962. The crowning jewel of the World's Fair was the 605-foot Space Needle that cost $6.5 million and is still a landmark in Seattle to this day. During its operation, the fair brought tourists and dignitaries from all over the world, including Prince Philip, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, and Elvis Presley, who filmed It Happened at the World's Fair on the grounds. In total, there were surprisingly only 325 larcenies committed, well below most estimations.
When a huge event like the World's Fair is put on in a city, it naturally brings in people from all over and all walks of life. Some come with different intentions. You could see an uptick in pickpocketing due to the dense nature of the crowds.
Susan Galvin was one of those people that moved to downtown Seattle in 1966. Born in 1946 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, but raised in Spokane, Washington, Susan grew up in a large family consisting of 2 sisters and 4 brothers. In 1966, Susan Galvin moves to downtown Seattle and lives in the Lower Queen Anne neighborhood. This area, now known as Uptown, is just north and west of Seattle Center. Susan gets a job as a records clerk at the Seattle Police Department, located not far from the Space Needle. She lives close to work and takes a similar route for every shift. She's quick to make friends with many of the people she sees on a daily basis. Days before she is murdered, Susan goes out on a double date with a girlfriend and two men they met from the Navy.
Finding patterns or anomalies in a victim's life is an important step in the investigation. It can lead to suspects not immediately evident. Retracing a victim's last days can often give insight into their mind and possibly lead you to a suspect you didn't know existed.
On the night of July 9th, 1967, Susan sets off for the graveyard shift at the police department, like she always does, through the Seattle Center parking garage. But there's someone that seems to know her routine and is following her. Susan never makes it to work. Her supervisor asks an officer if anyone has seen her. The officer says that Susan might have taken the night off. Susan's family hasn't heard from her in days. And every time they try to connect with her on the phone, they get no answer and are getting worried. Days later, Susan still hasn't reported to work, and no one has heard from her. Her supervisor is looking for any indicators of where she could be or have gone.
An investigator cannot play favorites when investigating a crime. It doesn't matter if you knew the person or not. You have to treat the case with the same professionalism as you normally would. If you lead with your heart instead of your mind, there could be things you miss because you're not thinking rationally.
After 4 days, Susan is finally found on July 13th at approximately 7 p.m. The parking attendant runs for help. Since the police station is next door, officers arrive within minutes.
Time is critical when it comes to any investigation, but especially a murder. A crime scene must be secured to ensure the integrity of evidence.
Susan's body wasn't found immediately because the parking garage and elevators inside were closed and locked up. The parking garage authorities tell police this is a common practice for them when there are no events going on at the Seattle Center.
The second a crime scene is discovered, it's contaminated. And while making every effort to collect evidence, you are contaminating it just by being there. So the focus is careful collection without causing any damage to forensic evidence.
Police are quick to question the two Navy men that Susan and her friend went out with days earlier, as they could be the last people to have seen Susan alive.
Some of the people that you bring in aren't necessarily suspects, but are persons of interest. If they are credible, they can attest to someone's state of mind. This can help investigators paint a picture of the victim and whom else they might have been with before.
The Navy men are not charged and are let go. The clock is ticking to find another suspect.
Early in the investigation, it's important to follow every lead that you come across, no matter how small or strange.
Despite the initial setbacks, detectives get a strong lead about an unexpected suspect. Susan Galvin moves to downtown Seattle and soon gets a job as a records clerk at the Seattle Police Department. Susan has only been there for a few months, but makes a lasting impression on all she meets. She also has an active social life and enjoys meeting new people. Susan's co-workers begin to notice that she's missing. Susan's body is found 4 days later inside an elevator car by an attendant in the Seattle Center parking garage. The elevators in the garage had been shut off as there was no activities at the center, which is common practice. Investigators act fast and question 2 Navy men that went out with Susan shortly before her death. However, no charges are laid against the men. A new tip comes in that says Susan was seen hours before her death with a man in clown makeup called Punchy. Punchy the clown is brought down to the police station for questioning.
Were you employed as a clown at the Seattle Center?
Yes.
Okay. At the Seattle Center, back in 1967, a young woman was killed. Do you remember that happening?
It was in the elevator across in the parking garage.
Exactly. That's interesting that you could remember that.
There's various types of interrogation techniques that an investigator can use. It all depends on the person you're talking to. One can be direct by presenting the evidence against them, use empathy to gain trust, or be repetitive to break down the suspect.
The investigator questions Punchy about why he was with Susan hours before her death.
Were you in that elevator with her?
No.
Did you have anything to do with her death?
No.
Okay. Did you ever have sex with her?
No.
Okay. Are you sure about that?
Positive.
Absolutely?
500%.
Another technique is keeping the room very cold. A cold room may increase a person's anxiety, which may break down any barriers a person is putting up so that the truth can come out. It could just also be a cold room.
The investigator then questions Punchy about quitting his job just days after he last saw Susan.
So this incident happened on a Sunday afternoon, and you ended up quitting your job a day or two later. Do you remember that? Do you remember quitting your job?
Yeah, I was going on. I had to go somewhere else, move away or something.
How come?
And that's just time to move, just a change.
Mm-hmm. But it seemed kind of abrupt to me as I was reading kind of the chronology of things.
No certain reason, just time to go on.
During the interrogation, there are often things that come up that could lead the investigation in a different direction, and you can't ignore those. Every possible lead and hunch should be followed up. This ensures that you are doing your due diligence and also respecting the life of the deceased.
The U.S. Constitution doesn't actually specify how long they can hold someone, and many states set their own limit. Most states use about a 72-hour timeline.
With no definitive evidence linking Punchy to Susan's death, he is let go. Punchy will remain a person of interest in this case until he can be definitively ruled out. In the meantime, investigators must continue to look for clues and witnesses. Because of the time of Susan's murder, before her midnight shift at the police department, finding witnesses is proving to be difficult for investigators. Back at the scene of the murder, officers are once again going over the area to make sure they don't miss a thing.
It's quite common to go back to the scene of the murder to look for more evidence. Even with the best intentions, there are things that can be missed the first time. These things can be big or small. Think of when you lose something at your home. You can turn your house upside down looking for the remote. But it's not until you stop looking or take a break that you actually see it was in front of you the entire time.
It's a whole new world of evidence collection from today to 50 years ago when this took place. The basics, however, stay the same.
Today, investigators have a whole new set of tools at their fingertips. One of those tools is DNA phenotyping. A forensic scientist will sequence a DNA sample so that it can indicate identifiable traits such as skin, eye, and hair color. In some cases, it can predict the age of a suspect. There's a new technology in biosensors used to determine minuscule traces of bodily fluids found within fingerprints. So if the deceased had contact with a murderer, even put their hands on them to push them away, the biosensors can pick up age, gender, and even medications.
On July 15th, 2 days after Susan was found, the King County coroner concludes that Susan died via suffocation. The autopsy posits that the killers placed either their hand or an object over her nose and mouth. She'd also been sexually assaulted. The coroner states the time of death was 11 p.m. on July 9th, an hour before Susan was due at work. Investigators continue to search for clues or evidence that could lead them to Susan's killer. They go through her apartment, collecting her clothing as evidence. Police doggedly continue to search for anything that can help them solve Susan's murder.
When an officer canvasses door to door, they are looking for potential witnesses, odd behavior, or anything unusual, including people. Generally, neighbors tend to keep to themselves. If they have a loud neighbor, they often won't complain in hopes that it will soon stop, and they won't have to make a scene or complain to the landlord. But they'll never forget the noises that came from that apartment.
They canvass Susan's apartment building, going door to door, hoping that someone, somewhere, heard something.
There's so much information you can gather going door to door. There's information about the victim and their activities leading up to their death. Did a new person come to their place? Was there a specific vehicle seen before the murder? It can identify suspects who, many times, will have a residence in the area. You're looking for anything out of the ordinary that could explain how the victim got into the situation.
On July 18th, a funeral is held for Susan at St. Joseph's Catholic Church. The family and members of the Seattle Police Department say their final goodbyes to Susan. What makes this day even harder for most is not knowing why Susan had to die and not knowing who did it.
There comes a point in certain cases where detectives exhaust all potential leads. It's a depressing feeling to know that you've done all that you can, but it's not enough. To see the family struggling with the death of their loved one and the lack of closure is so difficult.
Susan Galvin is found dead in a parking lot elevator. She had been suffocated and sexually assaulted and locked in the elevator. She wasn't found for 4 days. The investigation determines that Susan was murdered on her way to work the graveyard shift at the Seattle Police Department. Police interviewed 2 Navy sailors that had went out with Susan and a friend days before her death, but they are never considered actual suspects and let go. Police then zero in on a suspect that was with Susan hours before she was killed. Known around town as Punchy the Clown, police discovered that he had become friendly with Susan from passing each other on the street. On top of that, Punchy had quit his job just days after Susan's murder.
So this incident happened on a Sunday afternoon, and you ended up quitting your job a day or two later.
Yeah, that was going on. I had to go somewhere else, move away or something.
How come?
No certain reason, just time to go on.
While there is no evidence to connect him to the murder, he remains a person of interest. With all clues and leads drying up, the investigation into who killed Susan Galvin is put on hold.
The feeling that a detective has after working a case and getting nowhere is indescribable. It's obviously not as bad as what the family is going through, but no one involved in the investigation forgets about it. It's those cases that you can't close that stick with you the longest. We want to close the case as much as the family does.
Whenever the topic of Susan comes up in the Galvin household, the conversation is quickly stopped.
The loss of a loved one or family member can take on many different forms, all depending on the relationship at the time of death and your personal views on death. Some choose to confront it head on, others choose to talk about it, while others will keep it closer to themselves because they feel saying it out loud will make it true. But if they keep it inside and never acknowledge it, it's almost like it never happened.
Talking about Susan remains taboo in a Galvin household, which takes an emotional toll on the family.
Not talking or acknowledging a loss can take a massive emotional toll on a person because healing steps are not taken. It can only get worse and even manifest into physical hurt. Some people might take comfort from the grief and think if they get past it, the person didn't mean much to them.
Through the years, there are no updates to offer the family, and their hope for closure runs out. On September 13th, 2000, Susan's mother, Helen, passes away at age 77. She goes to her grave, never knowing who killed her daughter or why. In 2002, advancements in DNA testing have gone to the point that Seattle police think it can help solve some long-forgotten murders, including Susan Galvin from 1967.
It is quite astonishing that the evidence collected from Susan in 1967 was still viable in 2002. It is a credit to the officers at that time.
We always owe a huge debt of gratitude to the original crime scene investigators, because even before they could have known how powerful DNA would be, they somehow collected that evidence for us to work with almost, 50 years in the future. And so that's pretty incredible when you think about that.
Susan Galvin's clothes are collected and shipped off to Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory for DNA analysis.
So it really is like time travel. It's like having a time capsule to go back and help unravel these mysteries.
It is of utmost importance that the evidence carefully makes it to its destination, or the collection from the crime scene 35 years ago would have been for nothing.
Chain of custody is absolutely vital when it comes to prosecuting a case. Sometimes evidence doesn't make its way into court for days, months, or even years later. If there's a breakdown in the chain, that opens up the possibility that the evidence has been tampered with, and then it can be thrown out of court.
Once the evidence is received by the lab, technicians will perform what is called DNA profiling.
DNA profiling is a procedure that can identify a person based on their specific genetic makeup. So you're taking an old piece of evidence and examining it for DNA. Once you have that DNA isolated, you can compare it to someone in the criminal database. But that result only occurs if their DNA is in the database, usually as a result of a previous crime, or if they have willfully uploaded their DNA profile to a genealogy database.
DNA alone generally is not enough to get a conviction. It's a very integral part of the prosecution's case, but you generally need more evidence than just simply DNA.
Susan's brother Chris is on the phone with the Seattle police, who have an update on his sister's case. The DNA profile that they found on Susan's clothing does not match any of the DNA in the offender database.
A case is never closed until it is solved. Setbacks are heartbreaking, absolutely, but there are technological breakthroughs that happen every year. There's always hope the next advancement is the one that you need to help solve the case.
The promising lead has brought current-day investigators back to a complete stop. The news isn't all bad. The DNA profile obtained from Susan's clothing has given the police a genetic blueprint to work with. Now, it's a matter of when the technology will advance enough to utilize the DNA to find Susan's killer. Susan Galvin is just 20 years old when she is murdered in 1967 on her way to work. Witnesses are few and far between, and there's only one possible suspect. Punchy the Clown was with Susan hours before her murder, but there's not enough evidence to connect him to the crime. However, he will continue to be a person of interest going forward. Years later, there's hope that new DNA profiling techniques could help to identify Susan's killer. But there were no matches in the criminal database for the DNA profile found. The case is once again cold. In 2016, Seattle Police Detective Rolf Norton reopens the case. He feels the advances in DNA profiling are now at a stage that could provide answers to who Susan Galvin's murderer is. The man who played Punchy the Clown is now retired and living in Utah when Detective Norton tracks him down. Detective Norton introduces himself and tells Punchy why he's there, to tell him he is no longer a suspect in the murder of Susan Galvin. Newly processed DNA information proves that he was not at the crime scene.
Whenever new evidence is uncovered, it's always prudent for the investigator to cross-reference that against previous suspects. Police identify someone as a suspect for a very good reason. And no matter how much time has passed, you have to make sure. This can either confirm suspicions or rule out potential suspects.
In 2018, there are more advances, but this time forensic genealogy, including one of the most high-profile cases in the United States, the Golden State Killer.
D'Angelo was found using updated techniques in genetic genealogy. It uses DNA left behind, creating and tracing a family tree using profiles submitted to a public genealogy database.
Detective Norton sends DNA from the clothing of Susan Galvin to Parabon Nanolabs in Reston, Virginia. C.C. Moore has been working with law enforcement for close to 4.5 years. With the lab's help, they've been able to help law enforcement solve 1 crime per week on average, which adds up to more than 225 crimes.
So with traditional law enforcement investigations, they're using a very specific type of DNA test and DNA profile. And that DNA profile is very limited, has very limited information. It works great for one-to-one if you know who to compare it against, but it doesn't work great for finding your suspect. And so genetic genealogy is different, and the type of profile that we use, which is a different type of genetic markers, and we look at about 1 million of those genetic markers across the genome. And that gives us the power to identify distant cousins and to reverse engineer someone's identity from who they're sharing DNA with. And typically that's very distant relatives. We're not getting one-to-one matches. We're not getting close relative matches.
C.C. Moore applies her methods to the Susan Galvin case to try and find her killer.
The Susan Galvin case really hit me hard when I learned about it because it happened before I was born. So that was really interesting to be invited to help on a case that happened when I didn't even exist. The other, probably more compelling aspect of it is it happened in Seattle, right by the Space Needle. And my family is from Seattle. My parents met at University of Washington, and we drove up there pretty much every summer, went to the Space Needle, and it, really struck me that it could have been one of my family members.
With an almost personal connection to the case, C.C. Moore is motivated to find Susan's killer.
The first challenge with this case is that the DNA sample was mixed. So that means that the DNA contained the victim's DNA and the perpetrator's DNA. And fortunately, we have extremely skilled scientists that I work with at Parabon that are experts in deconvolution, which means extracting out the victim's DNA, so we're left with just that perpetrator's DNA. And so that really takes a lot of experience and training to be able to do that. There's a lot of attention in these cases on the DNA processing and the investigative genetic genealogy, but there's a really important step that happens in the middle. These are almost never pristine DNA samples. They're never optimal samples. They're almost always highly degraded. They might be contaminated with bacterial DNA, and they can be mixed, like in this case.
Once the genetic forensic team extracts the perpetrator's DNA, they can begin the process of building a family tree to hone in on Susan Galvin's murderer.
If people share significant amounts of DNA with each other, that means they have to have a common ancestor in their tree. The more DNA they share, the closer that common ancestor is in time, and the smaller amount of DNA they share, the more distant that common ancestor is in time. So for our top match, I needed to determine which branch of that match's family tree was going to connect to our killer. In order to do that, I looked at who else on that match list, who else that was sharing DNA with the killer, also shared DNA with that top match. When you can build the trees of multiple matches or people sharing DNA with your suspect and find how they connect. So that gives you one piece of his family tree. If they all share DNA and they have that common ancestor, it means that he will as well. So that gives us one piece of his family tree. The next thing that I had to work with was I knew that he was approximately 16% Native American. And that was interesting and quite unique because most of his ancestry was Northern European.
With each new branch added to the tree, Cece and the genetic forensics team gets closer and closer to naming Susan Galvin's killer.
So 16% kind of falls in the middle. A great-grandparent gives you about 12.5%, and a grandparent gives you about 25% of your DNA. So that meant that this killer either had a grandparent or great-grandparent of full Native American ancestry. And so that gave me something else to look for among the descendants of this genetic network. I knew that he had to be a descendant of this couple that I identified, and so I needed to trace all their descendants, build out the rest of their family tree, and see if one of their fairly recent ancestors was of Native American ancestry. And so I did find that a descendant of that genetic network couple married somebody who had a Native American ancestor. I could see through the matches that a number of people that were sharing DNA with this killer had ancestors all from Poland. So if all of their ancestors are from Poland and they're sharing DNA with him, that means he has to have some Polish ancestors as well.
The family tree is almost complete, and Cece has taken the investigation as far as she can.
And in this particular case, I knew that his direct paternal line, so his father's 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 line, likely had that Polish origin. And that's because we also looked at his Y chromosome, which is a different type of DNA. And so I knew these pieces had to come together. We had to have a descendant of the genetic network, we had to have a person descended from a Native American ancestor, and someone descended from Polish ancestors. And through marriages, I found all those pieces coming together, and they led to just one individual. He was the only individual who had the correct ancestral mix to be the person that left his DNA behind at that crime scene. Therefore, he must have been Susan's killer.
Now Detective Norton just has to find this individual. In 2019, with patience and advances in genetic genealogy testing, authorities have finally found the person responsible for the murder of Susan Galvin back in 1967. Cece Moore from Parabon Nano Labs took the DNA sample profile and through tracing descendants, found that only one person matched. Frank Whippich. Now, police must find him. Detective Rolf Norton doesn't have to search very hard for Frank. He died in 1987, but they still need proof.
When you work a very old case such as this one, it's not a big surprise when you find that the suspect is already deceased. Of course, it's always disappointing. You always hope that they will have to face justice. But on the other hand, in such a brutal case like this, I'm glad that his life was cut short because we don't know how many other victims there were or could have been in his lifetime.
Frank Whippich never had to answer to authorities. Nobody will know exactly what happened the day Susan Galvin died. The situation of her murderer being deceased and being the only other one that knew means that we can only speculate what happened. There's no journal or letter of confession. So really, it was DNA that tells the story of Susan Galvin's murder. But the fact that Frank Whippich lived freely is unjust.
Since Frank is long past, authorities must exhume his body from the Riverton Crest Cemetery in Washington State.
30 years later, there would still be viable DNA. There would still be some degradation to the body. It really depends on the conditions of the body and how it was stored. Most conservative guesses estimate that if the conditions are right, DNA can last hundreds of years.
After Frank's body was exhumed and his DNA collected, it was confirmed that it did match the DNA taken from Susan's clothing back in 2002. Susan's killer was Frank Whippich, but who was Frank and why did he kill her? Frank Edwards Whippich was born in 1941 and grew up in Seattle. He served 2 years in the U.S. Army. He was 26 years old at the time he murdered Susan Galvin. In 1966, Frank marries his 23-year-old girlfriend, Judith. The next year, the year he killed Susan, they have a child. Another one will follow in 2 years. Frank lived his life freely and was never suspected in Susan Galvin's death. Reports come out that Frank had a habit of impersonating security guards.
The reasons that someone impersonates a security guard can vary. One could fantasize of being a guard or be addicted to having power over ordinary citizens. It could also be to hide the fact that they are stalking someone under the guise of security.
In 1971, Frank and Judith divorce. Later that year, he is convicted of larceny. He will remarry the following year. In 1975, Frank is again arrested, this time for a weapons offense. His relatives tell police that he has been impersonating a police officer and making traffic stops, all the while carrying a gun.
Stolen valor is when an individual pretends to be a member of the military. It gives them a weird sense of power and respect from the public. It's using the uniform for false validation. It's disrespectful to anyone that's ever worn the uniform.
There are many reasons why someone would steal valor. It could be as simple as wanting to be part of a respected group. Instead of earning your way into it, you dress like it. Or there could be more devious reasons, such as collecting money for a supposed charity.
Frank spends 9 months in jail. In 1987, Frank Whippich passes away at the age of 46 from diabetes complications. In May of 2019, a press conference is held to announce that the case of Susan Galvin's murder is officially closed. The police chief presents Susan's brother, Chris, with the American flag that flew over the Seattle Justice Center the day Detective Norton solved the case.
It's a satisfying feeling when you finally solve a case that you and your co-workers have been working on for so long. For detectives, it's an uncomfortable burden to carry when the case isn't solved. As a detective, the drive to solve the case is so important, mostly for the family, but also for the department.
The detectives that originally worked the Susan Galvin murder case have all passed away, but their legacy remains in the way they collected the evidence to keep its integrity, to allow future investigators the opportunity to solve the case. This is the oldest case to utilize genetic genealogy to identify a suspect.
And initially, the pieces just weren't falling in place. But what was really key in this case was his mixed ancestry, the fact that he had these diverse origins, and I needed to find that one person that had that mix. And so when I found him, it was obvious it was him, because it was such an unusual combination of ancestry. There is a very common misconception that one match solves a case. People always ask me, what's the one match that solved a case? And it almost never and should never be one match. It should be a web of matches. It's like pieces of a puzzle. You've got to put them together one by one by one. And that web has to finally close in on just one person or one set of siblings. When I found him among the descendants of that genetic network, he had such a unique mix of ancestry that it really became obvious that this had to be the guy.
It is unjust that Frank was able to roam freely for years before serving time. Susan's family suffered knowing her killer wasn't behind bars.
So we owe this huge debt of gratitude to those original investigators, those crime scene investigators that collected that DNA, not even knowing what they were collecting and the value of that.
Armed with Frank Whippich's DNA profile, police continued to investigate if Frank had killed anyone else when he was in the Army and stationed in New York, Germany, and Alaska. While the family of Susan Galvin will never know why she was killed, more than 50 years later, they finally have closure, thanks to the decades-long determination of law enforcement officials.